Welcome to She's All Business. I'm Sophia, and I'm so excited to introduce you to our guest today, Tiffany Webber. She's going to talk to us about her life and how she became a creative director and an executive producer of fashion shows and luxury events. She produced over 100 fashion shows and luxury events and also co-curated many museum exhibitions. Tiffany, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I'm so happy I can meet you finally in person.
I know.
We've only seen each other on Zoom. And that's it. So this is really exciting for us.
This is very nice.
What is your favorite fashion staple that's in your closet right now?
Honestly, I think it's these boots.
Yeah?
Right now in the winter. It's my favorite thing, and they were gifted to me by a friend, and they're old Doc Martens, but not a typical looking Doc Marten.
Yeah.
And they were a limited edition. So everyone's always like, those are Doc Martens.
I mean, I love shoes. I just got like the Adidas Sambas, and I'm like, I know I'm late to the trend, but
it's okay. We wore them in the early 90s too.
Okay, great. So we're bringing it back.
They're bringing it back. It's so fun to see all of my middle school and high school fashions coming back.
Do you have a favorite fashion show of all time? Not one that you've worked on, like just one that you admire.
Oh, goodness. Again, so many. But one that I attended, didn't have to work on it, but loved was Telfar's show in February of 2019. It was at Irving Plaza. And it was essentially like a performance. Like it was like a rock and roll show meets mosh pit. It was a really important show. My colleague at the time has been a long time consultant to Telfar since he began in 2005. So she got me in.
I really want to start from the beginning with you and really dive deep into kind of your childhood, what you thought you wanted to do in your career, your family influences, and kind of take us through to your undergrad and graduate.
Yeah. So I come from my mom's side of the family, very much crafters and sewers and makers. And then my dad's side of the family, more like industrial artists and engineers. So a lot of photographers and engineers and architects and things like that. And both sides of my family, but especially my dad's side, real like collectors and historians. So, I mean, my entire apartment is outfitted with things that I've had my whole life. You know, I've always been someone and I would get things, and I've just always been like an artifact kind of person. And I kind of always knew I would do something artistic since I was very young. I was always drawing and painting and making paper dolls, and my mom sewed all of my clothes when I was little. So I would just sit in her sewing room for hours, and she'd give me something to like make while she was making my clothes. My grandmother knitted and crocheted. So it was like there was just always like making of fabric around me and making of clothing around me. And then as I got into like middle school and high school, I was just enamored with, models. And again, I'm going to age myself here. I graduated from high school in 93, and those late 80s, early 90s models, like you think of the supermodels, like Helena Christensen and Claudia Schiffer. I came up with those, the OGs, right?
Of course.
And so, I mean, we were all just completely obsessed. I was really into music and really into art and really into clothing and fashion. But it is interesting that my childhood, I wasn't as aware of fashion with a capital F. It was just much more like, oh, you make your clothes, you make your fabric, you make, it's just like you make everything. And then as I got into middle school and high school and became more aware, and I was also of the generation that MTV launched, MTV House of Style, all of these things were happening in my childhood and my middle school years, and they were hugely, hugely influential. So I was going to go to art school. I was actually thinking I was going to go to RISD, and then I ended up at this small kind of private New England college, but I studied art, but also sociology because I loved like cultural studies. I pretty much went from undergraduate almost directly to graduate school. I knew I wanted to go to graduate school because my very first job out of college was actually working at a museum, and working in a museum where I had to like give tours of these historic houses and all these decorative arts and these interiors and textiles and clothing.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I want to go get my graduate degree in this. So I went to graduate school to do like textiles and fashion merchandising and design,
Yeah.
and ended up getting to work with RISD, ironically, all those years
Oh my
later in
gosh.
graduate school. So I worked with the RISD Museum for a bit. But I really focused on museum curation and conservation. I was much more interested in the cultural phenomena of fashion. I didn't know that I wanted to work in fashion proper. I was maybe more academic about it, and in a way kind of returning to my roots of like when I was little and we would just make our stuff, you know, and like I was kind of interested in why and how people make things. So I've always had a more academic observer's view of the fashion world.
Mm-hmm.
Got out of graduate school and continued working in museums. My 20s were up in Boston
And it was
in these
mostly
museums. It was
museum.
all museum work. My career was very much teaching, research, writing, publishing, and museum curation. That's how
Yeah.
I started. I decided at 30 I wanted to move to New York. And I literally just sent an email to Parsons and was like, "Hi, I'm moving to New York. Got any classes I could teach?" And I heard back 30 seconds later, literally.
Holy
And they were like,
cow.
"Oh my gosh, we literally need someone right now to teach this." And I just moved to New York and
That's
went to
crazy.
Parsons.
That is so
And
crazy.
so then at the same time, I was at Parsons part-time. I got a job at the museum at FIT and the Whitney Museum. If I did it by decade, my 20s were very much like graduate school, research, writing, publishing, museum curation.
Very scholar.
Very scholarly. Up to my mid 30s, really till I had my kid at
Yeah.
35. When he went to nursery school, the very first day we met another family and their daughter, and the two of them became quick friends. And she was talking to me, and she had just moved from London, where she worked for a production agency that produces British Fashion Week, like London Fashion
Yeah.
Week. And she's like, "Oh, I have to open a New York office. We're going to start working on New York Fashion Week men's." And I was like, well, I teach at Parsons.
Yeah.
You know, if you ever need interns, let me know. She needed something on a project and like no one else was available. It was like some weird thing. And she's like, "Well, would you help me?" And I was like, "I guess. I mean, I've done museum exhibitions. I can try this."
Yeah.
And I did. And it was like, she's like, "Oh, you're really good at this." She's like, "Do you want to start producing fashion shows?"
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, "Oh, okay." But there was a translation for me from like doing installation work of
Mhm.
fashion and textiles into like live movement. And then like my late 30s into my 40s become like this whole fashion show producer. And that's when I
Yeah.
produced like 100 shows like throughout my late 30s and into my 40s.
You started out, was it Inca Productions?
It was Inca Production. So that was the friend that I made at the nursery school playground. I also like to share these stories because this is so much of how these jobs happen. Like connections. You just hang around, you talk to people, and it's so New York, right? That first day of nursery school, how does it happen that this other parent is like from Inca Productions in London? They're opening their New York office. They had literally just moved to New York like a couple weeks before. Yeah, and then it was so random that this first event was actually at MoMA for Polaroid, celebrating the polarization of sunglasses, 75th anniversary.
Cool.
And they were having this huge installation party at MoMA, and they needed these these light globes, needed this weird thing sewn for it. And I was like, "Oh, I'll see if I can get a student to do it." Could not get anyone to do it. And they're like, "Can you just sew them?" And I was like, "Sure." So I sewed these things. So I was only meant to sew these things and install them. And again, I knew a lot of that from my conservation work and like museum stuff. So I get there, install, sew, put everything together. And then they're like, "Well, if you want to hang out for the event, you can." I'm like, "Okay." And so I just kind of hung out. And then they were like clearly in need of extra hands. So I just jumped in and they were like, "Oh, you're so good at this." And I'm like, it's just from working in museum. You know, it's like museum work is very production like work too sometimes. So, and doing installations and exhibitions and conservation. So then they're like, "Do you want to just start producing things?" And I was like, "Sure." But I really was winging it and learning it on the fly and shadowing people who were way better at it than me.
I know you said there's a lot of similarities with curation and production, but what was like the differences that you found?
So the biggest difference is when you work on a museum exhibition, you might work on it from 2 to 5 years. doing tons of research and writing. Like the scholarly part of it is massive. There's a huge like lead time.
Got it.
That is obviously not there for a fashion show. I mean, I've produced fashion shows in 5 days if I've had to. It's nice when you have 6 months, and usually shows are about a 6-month plan. Now, there have been other events that I've worked on that took a year to work on because they were massive or something. But so the lead time is very different. There's not the same scholarly research, obviously, but I always make it a point to really know my client and study their work. It's just my natural inclination to study their work, know where they're coming from, like what their values are. Because I think about it this way. If you're working, especially because I really do focus on a lot of emerging talent and emerging designers, those first fashion shows are so important to fashion history. And being a fashion historian and like cultural historian, I know how important those first like 5 seasons are, and they get archived and they are the foundation for the brand, right? So I approach production from a very scholarly standpoint and like an archivist. In terms of the actual producing, when you put an exhibition together, you have to work with installers, art installers, conservation. Like it's a whole team of people to actually put this in a gallery. It's the same in a venue.
You started with this production side of things and you didn't really know exactly what was happening. You were thrown into venue and show production, also talent managing, then creative directing. What are kind of the differences between those roles, and were you just kind of thrown into it randomly, or did you kind of have to progress along?
Yeah, I progressed along for the most part. And like Inca, I'm so lucky, was like the best training ground ever. They're a boutique luxury house out of London, and they just do everything at the highest level. So like, again, couldn't have asked to have a better run-in at the playground. Like it's like they're very, very high level. So I feel like my production training ground was at the luxury level, so I'm so lucky that was my experience. I went into backstage production first. So when we did Men's Fashion Week, we had, I don't know if you're familiar with the Google building now on the West Side Highway.
I am, actually.
That was a big warehouse that we had Men's Fashion Week in. And I miss it. But it was, and we had different platforms inside of it. We had platform 1, which was the really big designers. Platform 2, more mid-career. And then platform 3 was for emerging talent. So I started out doing backstage for platform 2, more mid-size. And then I moved into becoming the main producer for platform 2, and then even became ultimately platform 1. And it just came with time and experience and bigger crowds and higher level clientele. And then I worked with them through February 2020 when we didn't realize we were spreading COVID. Yeah. And they actually closed their New York offices during COVID.
Oh gosh, okay.
And about a year later in 2021, I think, September of 2021, they were getting contacted like, are you guys open? Can we do some fashion shows? And they were like, we're not sure what we're going to do yet. So they passed them to me. And they released me from my contract so I could just take the clients directly, which was great.
So that's when you started your own Tiffany Webber production.
I mean, it's like not that official, but I guess it kind of
official.
Is. Yeah. Yeah. So I've really been doing that on my, they still wonderfully and generously pass a lot of work on to me. But I don't have to do it through them. Since 2021, I really just love focusing on emerging designers. Yeah, it's much more I mean, I'm so glad I've done like big things with LVMH. I mean, I'm glad I've had all the experiences, but I feel like I have found my lane with emerging talent, many of whom are Parsons alum. I've done so many Parsons alum shows. And that has been really nice. And I like focusing on that.
Because I know you've talked about it a lot before, how you really focus on emerging and mid-career a little bit. Mm-hmm. What is the reason that makes you really more hone into working with them?
Again, I think it's the archivist in me, and I think it's the teacher in me, because the first 5 seasons really make or break a brand. So many brands like fade into oblivion and we never see them again. And those first 3 to 5 seasons are so hard too. It's so hard to get the funding. Fashion shows are hugely expensive and resource heavy.
Well, 5 seasons, that's only 2.5 years.
It's only 2.5 years, but it really makes a big difference in a brand's longevity or lack thereof. And like I was saying before, I really love to think about how, we think about a heritage brand and we look back at their history and see how they started. I love being at the starting point, like Willie Chevrier is a great example because I was FaceTiming with him in Paris. He was in Paris and I was talking to his PR team. And he was like, "Can you believe I'm in Paris?" And, where I did my colleague and I did his very first shows like in 2017. Yeah. And I don't know, it's like proud mom moment. I don't know what it is, but I think the most help needs to happen there. It's a huge void of it being approachable and accessible and representative, right? And I think one of the more creative times too, because when you don't have a ton of money, you have to get really scrappy and very DIY. And again, I think that's the artist and maker in me. That's like, all right, you have like a $5 million idea. How can we bring it to life for $5,000? Like I love figuring out those puzzles.
I think this is really important for people to know. You love your job, right?
Yes.
But there's always something that you might not love, that might be your least favorite, that you have to do to get the job done. What is that for
Well,
you?
with production, it is physically very demanding. I mean, the actual show days can be 12, 14, 16, 20 hours long. And now that I am 50, I'm like, I would love for younger people to do that. Like, it's so physically hard on your body. And I often stand the whole time because I know if I sit down, I'll never get up. So like, I will be standing for 16 hours straight, like just running around a venue. And, it keeps you in good shape, but like it's so physically demanding.
Like a typical fashion week, how many productions do you have?
So again, post-COVID, I have so put the brakes on it. But when I was with Inca, and this is when I was, late 30s and into my 40s, one day we did 8 or 9 shows in one venue, just turn them around all day long from 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. every 3 hours a show. So I was averaging 6 shows a day for like 3 to 5 days. I would be like, wow. It would take me a week or more to recover. I have to go get like massages and acupuncture. It's very, very physically demanding work. So that part is hard. The other part is you have to really be able to handle all sorts of personalities, and you cannot let anything ruffle your feathers. Like, you just have to be so even. I was holding my production schedule and someone was mad at me that a model hadn't showed up yet. I'm like, they're stuck in traffic. I mean, this is fashion week. Good, like, this is how it is. They grabbed my production schedule out of my hand, tore it up, and sprinkled it over my head. Like, people just, I always think like, it's so high pressure and stress because everyone has worked for months for this 15 minutes. And I always think about it like, these are their babies, this is their baby being born and they got 15 minutes to make or break, right? So you have to be ready to take anything. You have to know yourself very well to know what you are willing to put up with and what you're not willing to put up with.
You have had to have learned so much about yourself.
Yeah.
What is one thing that you learned throughout this entire time frame about your interest?
I know we're definitely in a culture that praises the visionary and the genius and the creative director. I get it. But I am so much more fascinated by the people who can like build a set and like make the lighting change the world. That is so much more fascinating to me. But there are people who need to have the recognition, need to have the credit. Yeah. I am not one of those people.
What was something that somebody has taught you that kind of stuck with you?
2 producers at Inca, Jade and Laura, just geniuses at what they do. And they essentially mentored me. And just watching someone have such a good eye, and you want to develop your eye that way, right? So it's like, oh, I get it. I get why they should be seated this way. Oh, I get how you should shape this space. Or, oh, I see how that lighting changed that entirely. Or, oh, I see when you called that model and waited that extra second, it was more impactful. So just, it's like very fine tuning of essentially a curatorial eye, where it's like an editorial curatorial eye, where these little things that no one else would know, but I know waiting that beat made a huge difference, right? So those are the kinds of things now I try to go into a space and imagine that and think about. And the whole idea of the money shot is like, you want to be on that Vogue runway, right? So what would be the most fantastic shot in this space? From what angle? From what vantage point?
Do you think there was, a couple years in where you were like, yes, I got it? Or like kind of when was that time frame?
Yeah, that would have been in the first year, because I did so many shows in that first year. And honestly, the sheer volume of shows, the sheer number of shows that I did in those first couple seasons of Men's Fashion Week, it was like, okay, I'm getting it now, like so fast.
What would you recommend to somebody that would be interested in production to be doing now?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to network first and foremost. Be a connector. Never be afraid to just reach out to people, cold call them, like send an email, send a DM. I always say, if there's like a brand you love, stalk them. If there's a position you're fascinated by, find people who do that position. But one thing that I'm loving right now is finally on Instagram, everyone who works on a production is getting tagged.
Yes.
Finally. It's credits. I'm the person who at the movies stays and watch all the credits. People hate going to the movies with me, but I'm like, who did that hair? Like, just be so curious, be slightly obsessive, find out who the people are that no one knows. They're the ones doing it. Reach out to them, find out. And you just say, can I help? Can I volunteer? What can I do? I'll get the water bottles for you. Be willing to do anything within reason. Yeah. And you're going to have to volunteer in the beginning. That's the only way. You really have to be willing to put yourself out there, but you've got to do your due diligence. You've got to do your homework and look for the people behind the scenes. They're going to be your connections.
On all of my shows,
yes,
I always ask the guest if there is an opportunity with an internship, shadowing, networking that you can offer to the listeners so that they can apply.
Definitely. Number one, if you're a Parsons student and want some experience, I always need help on the Parsons shows that I produce. So I produce the AES fashion show in May. I produced the BFA fashion show in May, and I produced the MFA fashion show during September Fashion Week. As long as you're part of the New School community and you want that experience, and are willing to do any ridiculous task that needs to be done, definitely reach out to me, because I always need a lot of hands to help on those shows. So that's really fun. And then the other thing in that experience, you definitely get to shadow me for that. And then I'm always open. Like, if anyone wants to reach out and have coffee with me, I can review resumes, portfolios, give you career advice. I'm always happy to do that too.
Well, I'd love to hear that. Is there an email that they can reach out to?
Yes. So Webber, WEBBERT @newschool.edu is the best way to reach me. I do recommend following the Parsons AAS Fashion Instagram, the Parsons BFA, and MFA FDS, because some of the work that I do is on those Instagrams because I produce their shows. So,
well, thank you so much, Tiffany.
My pleasure. This was wonderful.
I really appreciate you supporting me and just coming here.
I love this. This whole idea is fantastic.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
All right.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.